All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books, Literati Books, and Seminary Co-op Bookstores welcoming writer, historian, and activist Rebecca Solnit, who will discuss her literary biography, Orwells Roses. Tonight, Solnit will be in conversation with best-selling author of Pleasure Activism and Emergent Strategy and the brand new Grievers, Adrienne Maree Brown. I would like to thank you all on behalf of the three bookstores producing and participating in this event. We are incredibly thankful for your support. When you support an independent bookstore, you help us keep our doors open, you help us keep our staff employed and operating, and you help us keep bringing you incredible authors like the two authors this evening. So we would like to thank you all so much for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I am the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. We produce hundreds of author events each year, and I am so thankful to be producing this event this evening for you. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, towards the end of the hour, towards the end of the event. So you can type your questions as a comment, and you can do that at any point in time throughout the event. Now, about tonight's book, Orwells Roses. A lush exploration of roses, pleasure, and politics, and a fresh take on George Orwell as an avid gardener whose political writing was grounded in his passion for the natural world. In the year 1936, a writer planted roses. So begins Rebecca Solnit's new book, a reflection on George Orwell's passionate gardening and the way that his involvement with plants, particularly flowers, and the natural world illuminates his other commitments as a writer and anti-fascist, and the intertwined politics of nature and power. I will share a blurb from Terry Tempest Williams, the author of Erosion. A kaleidoscopic view of a man we thought we knew, by a woman who keeps surprising us with her dazzling mind. Solnit has written an exquisitely layered book, soaring in its reach, subversive in its scope, and joyous in its pleasure to read. Her exploration into how and why cultivating beauty matters, alongside fighting injustices, as Orwell's Garden supported his fierce critique of fascism, reminds us of the singular fact: life is both flower and thorn. This profound and graceful book not only redefines what is Orwellian, it reimagines how we might live a life of greater intention by opening our hearts to what is beautiful, brave, and of earth. And about tonight's speakers. Rebecca Solnit is the author of more than 20 books, including Recollections of My Non-Existence, A Field Guide to Getting Lost, The Faraway Nearby, A Paradise Built in Hell, River of Shadows, and Wanderlust. She is also the author of Men Explain Things to Me and many essays on feminism, activism, and social change, hope, and the climate crisis. A product of the California public education system from kindergarten to graduate school, she is a regular contributor to The Guardian and other publications. And tonight, Rebecca will be in conversation with Adrienne Maree Brown. Adrienne Maree Brown is the writer-in-residence at the Emergent Strategy Ideation Institute and author of Grievers, the first novella in a trilogy of the Black Dawn imprint. Holding Change, The Way of Emergent Strategy, Facilitation and Mediation, We Will Not Cancel Us, and Other Dreams of Transformative Justice. Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, and the co-creator of Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction from Social Justice Movements, and How to Get Stupid White Men Out of Office. She is the co-host of the How to Survive the End of the World, Octavia's Parables, and Emergent Strategy podcasts. Adrienne is rooted in Detroit. And now, without further ado, I am so happy and proud to welcome our fantastic guests for the evening. We have Rebecca Solnit and Adrienne Maree Brown.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you.
Thank you. And how incredibly exciting to be with you, even in this ethereal public way, Adrienne.
Oh, yes. I'm very, very, very pleased to be in your company, in particular your company around this book, Rebecca. It's very awesome what you've done with this.
Thank you.
Like I was telling you a little before, but I want people to know, like, I'm someone who reads very quickly. Generally, I pick stuff up and I'm like, I'm moving through it. And this book, it feels like it's of this time, and that it made me slow down, meander, wander. I kept pausing and going and like looking stuff up and being like, what was happening then? Like, how is this? Where did you find this? And I have a lot of questions for you, and I want to be in conversation with you because I feel like this text is in conversation with so many things I love and care about and think about. So we'll be soft in it and we'll flow in it. But I think the first thing I want to ask you is, can you tell us how and when you first became aware of Orwell as a gardener, as a rose man?
There's two layers to that. But before that, I just want to say I'm so excited to be with you because your work, like the Zapatista's writings 25 years earlier, has been emerging into the world, giving me a sense that there's more room for hope and pleasure and kindness and joy and subjectivity in our political work. And that is always helpful and sometimes beautiful and exciting. So when they asked me, who do you want to talk with on this book tour? I was like, oh my God, can you get Adrienne Maree Brown?
Like, easily. They got me so fast and easily. I was like, what?
Well,
yes.
Well.
I want to talk to you.
And so then, as for how I knew about his roses, so when I was young and poor, I bought a battered copy of this really ugly Orwell reader. That was how I really got to know his essays. I'd read 1984, An Animal Farm, and a novel or two besides those. But I really hadn't encountered the essays that much, and I devoured them, and I was so young. There's that like first layer of soil out of which everything will be rooted you do in your life, and the stuff you read when you're really young. And so it really helped form me as an essayist myself. And the essay I loved in a very particular way is called A Good Word for the Vicar of Bray. Yeah. And Orwell talks about how the planting of a tree might outlive anything else you do, good or bad. He talks about, various figures who are otherwise not particularly admirable, but who planted trees that are still living, the king of Burma, the Vicar of Bray himself, who was politically fickle in the religious wars in England in his time. And then he talks about going back to visit a garden he had planted 10 years before, and seeing that the 7 roses and the several fruit trees were still thriving, and thinking about how the trees might grow into the 21st century. So I knew that when I was probably 20 or 21, and I always thought, oh, this is this beautiful, pleasurable, kind of joyful essayist who Orwell might have been had he not lived in such a difficult, crazy time. Right. And then my friend Sam Green has a tree-related project. He's a filmmaker and one of my closest friends, and we're sitting around yakking about trees in the summer of 2017. And I mentioned Orwell had planted fruit trees, and we got excited and decided to see if they were there. And of course, all Google Maps will give you is green blobs that could be anything. So when I was on my way from London to Cambridge on book tour that November, I arranged to stop at the train station and catch a taxi to the cottage he had lived at in 1936, which was about 3 miles away through the countryside. Just thinking I might be like trespassing, peeking over somebody's fence, being snubbed at the front door. But it was such a great rural experience. The taxi driver knows exactly where I'm going. He pulls up to the house. He sees the owner of the house standing in the road, and he says, oh, there's Graham now. I'll just introduce you. Graham Lamb himself, to whom I owe all this, is this lovely, kind man who's apologetic for not answering Sam's letter from several months earlier, invites me in, introduces me to his partner, Dawn. Eventually, we get around to the fact that the fruit trees have been cut down. And then after a cup of tea and visiting Nigel next door, who remembers the fruit trees and so forth and so on, they say very casually, oh, but the roses he planted are still growing. Would you like to see them? And that kind of blew my mind and I realized that I'd never thought hard enough about what it meant that Orwell, of all people, planted roses. He's often seen as this very manly, stern, austere, pessimistic, grim figure. And of course, he's also a socialist, and planting fruit trees makes sense by any utilitarian standard.
Yeah.
But planting roses, that raises a lot of exciting questions. And this book is just a series of answers to that question. I'm going to do something I don't normally do on these things. The sun is shining off the hardwood floors and this blinding glare at this particular time of day, because you Eastern people, it's still daytime here. So I'm going to
I
go
was like, no.
something over the shine and be right back.
Okay.
I can hear you if you wanted to say anything, or
Okay, cool.
everyone can wait on me over.
I can talk to the absence of you. I mean, there's this line that you have, which is, if war has an opposite, gardens might sometimes be it. And it hadn't occurred to me until I read it that Orwell was someone who would be concerned with things that were not war and not fascism and not totalitarianism and not, like, I think there's a way that when we are given the, here's the essential detritus of this person, this is what this person left behind, that it's like, oh, this must be what they were about. This is all they cared about. This is what they did. And this idea that maybe even more than he wrote, he was gardening. And maybe even more than he cared about what was in the book, he cared about his gardens. That felt like it kept coming through. As like, he was like, I care about life, which is, it was profound. It felt like a profound transition. And I wanted to ask you before we move, I want to ask you all kinds of things about, like, how did you craft this? But before we get there, what do you see as other potential opposites of war, especially now, these days, right now?
Of course, I'm old enough to remember people saying, make love, not war.
Oh,
and
yes.
Of course, a lot of that just meant weird sex of the 60s variety with all the misogyny perpetuated in the name of liberation. Speaking of someone who's hit on a lot by hippie dudes when I was a tween in the early 70s. But it's interesting, because I also want to say gardening can be violent. The conquest, the theft of land from Native Americans was first, that land was first given to farmers. The kind of farming that created the Dust Bowl, that's depleting topsoil,
that's right,
destroying habitat, is also a kind of gardening. And I'm reading a wonderful book by James Rebanks, who's a British farmer who modernized the family farm with his father, and then realized, a la Rachel Carson, that they were destroying all the wildlife because this was happening all across the island, and went back to a much more sustainable kind of farming. And there's a phrase in the book that I'm hoping to talk to him about too, bread and roses, because bread being the utilitarian stuff that revolutionary movements, left-wing people always want to get for the people. But the roses, in that old call from the suffragists and the labor movement for roses, is about the incalculable, the immeasurable, about pleasure and joy and its subjectivity and beauty. So I also feel like, at their best, gardens make room for those things, but they can also be instruments of imposition and control and authority. So,
I mean, this is, I think, what is true of almost all pleasures, is that there's a way that a pleasure can be in alignment with life, moving towards life, and in alignment with the planet, and alignment with all the lineages we carry that want to move towards the future. And there's a way that almost every single pleasure can be misused, abused, put into a power play, put into a positionality. And I think that, especially in this moment, with the way that capitalism has co-opted the entire realm of pleasure, it's so hard sometimes to find a pleasure that is not a product, but an experience that you can have whether you have resources or don't have them, which is what I loved about the reminder of, like, what can happen in the garden, where, sometimes you are tending it a lot, and sometimes you're just putting stuff into the ground and going on about your life. And either way, life produces something in response to that initial effort, that initial seeding. And that what it creates is rhizomatic. And I saw that throughout this, is that idea of, like, moving in all these directions. And I actually felt like you know, if the initial thing of finding out about the roses was a seed for you, it feels like the text is this rhizomatic thing that then moves out from the seed in so many directions. And I wanted to ask you a little, like, how did you plant the garden of this book? Like, how did you understand where and how to move in this text? Because it feels like we're meandering with you, and yet you hit these points where I'm like, oh no, that was built towards. How did you do this book? How did you craft it?
You know, it felt like it's one of the things that's been annoying me is people calling it a collection of essays, which is like calling your family a collection of people or a tree
No,
a
yeah.
collection of sticks. And I think of it as like 7 journeys from the same starting point, and the starting
Mhm.
point is a sentence that gets repeated in variation at the head of each of the 7 sections. In the year 1936, a writer
Yes.
planted roses. For the one that's about
Yes.
imperialism, colonialism that ends with Jamaica Kincaid, it's like in the
Yes.
year 1936, an Englishman planted roses. But it's really like,
Yeah.
where do we go from this simple fact that this guy planted roses? And it's like, what do the roses mean? Who is this
Yeah.
person? What's going on in 1936? What is the garden about? How do and the roses also stand in both for flowering plants in particular and for the whole plant world, which is often seen as this passive, decorative, also often feminized part of the world, and is instead
Yeah.
this incredibly powerful kingdom. The plant kingdom, in many ways, did far more than the animal kingdom to shape the world,
Yeah.
and is determinative of our survival in the future. As plants sequester carbon, we throw it back into the sky. And
Mhm.
one of the things that's so striking about this garden Orwell plants, his first real garden in his first good home as an adult, and he's in his early 30s, is that he's just come from the coal mines in the north of England to write the book that would called The Road to Wigan Pier. That's a report and a meditation on poverty, unemployment,
Mm.
economic injustice, and the utter brutality and ugliness and kind of deathliness of the coal mining world,
Yeah.
the lives
Yeah.
of the miners, the dangerousness of the mines, what it's like to be in an incredibly hot tunnel 3 feet high, deep under the earth, where men work all day for all their lives or die horribly from gas, collapse,
Yeah.
explosion, injury. And the fact that he comes straight back from this to start a garden is a sense that the coal industry, which is the backbone of the whole industrial revolution and British power, is also a background to the garden. So it's also looking at we've talked for 80 years about what Orwell was against.
Yes.
Fascism, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, lies,
Yes.
human rights violations, but what was he for? And that's always a question you can ask. And I think it's something that your work deals with so much. I think a lot of activists forget what they're for. You kind of lock onto the enemy. You're trying to defeat capitalism, or this logging
Yes.
company, or this maquiladora, or this, oil company. And you kind
Yeah.
of forget who you are. You forget what it means to win. You forget what you love. And I think you have to just not even as self-care, but just to be a good activist, you can't lose sight of that. And so
Yeah.
and there's also a way I want to say early on, I wrote a book about an old, dead, upper middle class white Englishman. And part of why I did is because I feel like there's a lot of people doing that now, but they're often like, oh, they're women, they're people of color, they're queer, they're counterculture,
Yeah.
they don't really matter, etc. But Orwell's like this absolutely
Yeah.
unassailable figure. And I felt like if Orwell is actually somebody who's taking time out for pleasure and joy and beauty, doing all this other stuff, who begins writing 1984 by essentially moving to an island and launching a farm,
Yeah.
then we're all off the hook for that bullshit version of diligence that the left in its austerity is so often trying to impose on us. And I grew up around the left and spent most of my adult life there. And there's always this sense of like, you should be doing more and trying harder, and everything you do that isn't productivity is indulgence. And
Yes.
there's a sense where it feels very much like we're all supposed to be little Fordist assembly lines with a Model T rolling off the assembly line every 10 minutes. And
Exactly.
even to have agrarian or hunter-gatherer metaphors where, production comes,
Mhm.
whatever, getting your needs met comes from much more complex, collaborative, interactive, observant processes, not just
Yes.
grinding out product all the time. So I
Yes.
felt like if we can show that Orwell does this, then he's
Yes.
given us all cover to, have our full lives, to do all these things we need to do. And I've also been really interested in what are those things that we need to do that might be dismissed as indulgent, trivial,
Yes.
bourgeois. And a lady actually writes in to tell him flowers are bourgeois,
Yes.
but that are actually essential to doing the most important work we do. And I quote this great essay by Lawrence Weschler. We asked the judge in the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, how can he stand to listen to these stories of rape and torture of neighbors doing unspeakable
Mm.
things to neighbors in the Bosnian wars? And the judge pauses, then his face brightens, and he says, oh, after work, I go look at the Vermeers in the museum.
Yes.
And so like all that, which of course goes so over to you. Everyone should,
Yes.
wrong hand, everyone should still have the books up here. I think it's in Pleasure Politics. You talk to someone who says, is it possible for pleasure and justice to feel the same way in our collective body? And that's
Yes.
so direct. And so this book of mine is the world's most indirect way of getting at that.
Yeah. Well, it feels like, it doesn't feel indirect. It feels spacious to me, right? It feels
Yeah.
spacious. It feels like what happens, I think what happens inside of movement in the left right now is we are living inside of capitalism, and capitalism is living inside of us. And as we come up against it, we still have the shape of it all through us and in us, and it's deep. And then that's layered onto that fascism and neo-fascism that's happening. So there's all this stuff around competition with each other, hyper productivity, order, like this idea of some rigor that takes us actually away from, right, being alive. And I know when I was working on emergent strategy that I was like, this might get me kicked out. Like I might get my left card revoked on this one, because I need to talk about these ants and these bees and these creatures who are living, and their lives matter immensely to the ecosystems that they're a part of, even though they can't organize and they don't necessarily have sentience in the way that we understand it. But there's something happening there that is what it's all about. That life cycle is what it's all about. And I think that when we pay more attention to the living world, including ourselves, right, the cycle of aliveness that moves in all of us, I think it actually makes us better humans, which then makes us able to interact with humans in a better way about a compelling future. I don't think it's a compelling future to just eke out survival, even though we're obsessed with dystopia. I don't think any of us want to live there. So I think it was one of the things that I loved was like, even, and I said this to you before too, I'm going to go back and read 1984 again, because I was deeply moved. You kept turning and turning and turning over the found objects that you had. You're like, I have these books of his, I've got these letters I found, there's this rose bush, there's, and you kept looking at things from so many angles. And one of the things you looked at was 1984. You reread it. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you discovered in this rereading of it that feels informed by Orwell's love of gardening and nature.
Yeah, one of the things I love about having been alive now 10 years over half a century,
Yeah.
having these long relationships with works of art. And I
Yes.
wrote a while ago about the movie Giant, which, I saw every decade, and like it was a different movie every time. It's about queerness.
Yeah.
It's about the transition from a cattle to an oil culture. The racial dynamics, because it's also about Elizabeth Taylor as an anti-racist ally against
Yes.
her husband in Texas. And, in 1984 was kind of like that, except that I hadn't really evolved decade after decade. I thought I knew the book. And only
Yeah.
after I met his roses in person, if those roses I met in Wallington, England on Day of the Dead 2017 are actually the ones he planted, we're not totally sure. But at the time, the people who owned the house were pretty confident they were, and that got me off and running. But so I read 1984 again. And one thing I discovered, because when you read his essays, they're thrown at you by all kinds of organization other than chronology. He wrote this whole cluster of essays about pleasure. It's like he wanted to be Adrienne Maree Brown, but like this guy dying of TB in post-war bombed out Blitz London. But he writes about all these pleasures and joys and just kind of things that are really pretty accessible to everyone. You know, in praise, you know, just in praise of just enjoying the weather and stuff. One of them is about junk shops and finding a piece of coral embedded in a paperweight in a junk shop. And there's a way you can imagine, like, our imaginary leftist censor who's always telling us everything except, you know, manning the barricades, and I use that verb intentionally, is trivial and self-indulgent, is that becomes one of the central symbols in 1984, that coral paperweight. So it's like wandering around junk shops is essential to writing the great novel against totalitarianism. So, you know, cut us all some slack. But rereading it again, a bunch of things struck me. First of all, it's so full of sensual pleasures. And again, this is again Orwell trying to be Adrienne Maree Brown, in that how does Winston rebel against Big Brother? He is not a successful smasher of empire. He never takes up arms. He tries actually to join the resistance, but it's all a trap. He never does it. What he does is a kind of prefigurative politics. He lives, he chooses to remember, he chooses to love. He has this passionate love affair with love in both senses, lots of sex, lots of emotion. He cherishes beauty, subjectivity, and inner life. And the very opening of the book struck me this time around. Winston has bought in the junk shop, he will later get the paperweight with the coral in it. He's bought an old blank book, and the very texture of the paper, this creamy old paper they don't make anymore, has this kind of sensuality to it. He's going to write in the old way Orwell probably wrote as a kid, with the nib pen, you dip it in inkwell. And that itself is something he could die for. You know, if they find out he's doing this, let alone what he's writing in this journal. And so he's already essentially sentenced himself to death. And now he just has to decide what he's going to do before. So there's the first thing that happens is this act of rebellion. That's an act of subjectivity, self-expression, and kind of the life of the senses. But the thing that utterly blew me away, that I didn't remember at all from the book, well, there's two things that struck me. First of all, Orwell does not, although his aunt was a wonderful suffragist and his mom was a suffragist sympathizer as women were trying to get the vote in the Britain of his childhood, he doesn't really score high on feminist points for most of his life. But the people who stand against Big Brother directly and symbolically in 1984 are women, and they're these very powerful, almost goddess figures. His lover, Julia, and another thing striking about the book is how subjective it is. He dreams of a place the novel calls the Golden Country, just this ordinarily beautiful landscape. And he dreams of a woman in it who tears off her clothes with this bold, expansive gesture of, you know, fearless sexuality. And then he goes to a place Julia, his lover, directs him to make love for the first time. It looks exactly like his dreams, down to the molehills. And with that expansive gesture, she takes her clothes off. And like, this is not a realist novel, which I always thought it was. Dreams do not come true in realist novels like that. But the most compelling figure for me, and the one who I think is the case for Orwell's hope, is not Winston, because a lot of the readings of the novel are like, oh, but Winston Smith is tortured, submits, is destroyed, betrays, etc. But Winston is not who we're supposed to pin our hopes on. And Winston doesn't pin his hopes on himself. He keeps saying, if there's hope, it lies with the proles. And so the rest of that love affair is consummated in a room above the junk shop. He got the old book and the paperweight in. And out the window, 3 times in the novel, he sees this stout washer, or the stout working class woman hanging out diapers. And I think the first time he sees her, each time she's singing this beautiful, if I'm pronouncing it right, contralto voice with a heavy Cockney accent, and Orwell and Winston think the song is sentimental rubbish, but it's a song about love, attachment, memory. So the diapers represent care going forward for the next generation. The song represents memory and tenderness, and the voice represents beauty. But he sees her as this goddess. She could have been there for 1,000 years. She has this incredible strength. And then something really remarkable happens to Winston that I think also happens to Orwell. The last time, just before Big Brother, agents break in and capture him and Julia, and the novel is going to end in horror, he sees her one last time, and he has this thought, why shouldn't the rose hip be as beautiful as the rose? He sees maybe in girlhood she was like a rose. You bloom, it's brief, it doesn't last, but then comes the rose hip. So he sees her as a rose hip, not a rose, but sees the rose hip is beautiful. And it's something, and we don't have a lot of books from before about 20 minutes ago in which stout middle-aged women are seen as beautiful, let alone ones written by anybody, let alone men.
That's right.
But it's also amazing to me because this is something I've been interested in a lot of my writing life. What we get from the natural world is not only physical sustenance and spiritual spaciousness, but the very metaphors with which we understand the world. And so you can see Orwell had at hand roses as a metaphor for describing what I think is the pivotal moment in the novel, recognizing the power and the beauty of this woman who is the prole and that Winston has hopes in.
Yes.
That was very ungrammatical. And so you can see that the roses have this very direct function. So that made 1984 totally different than I remembered and really fucking exciting.
Yeah. I mean, it's a refresh, like there's a way that you uncover enough of Orwell to make him fresh, to make him relevant, and to make the writing relevant and fresh in a different way. It's like, we're like, oh, of course we're living inside of this condition that feels like overwhelmingly powerless at times. It's like we're pushing so hard, and are we winning? Are we winning? Is anything changing, or are we getting pushed back? And yet it's like the beautiful survival is happening at all times. And Octavia E. Butler called it the horrible ordinary. It's like there's this ordinariness, and inside of that there's beauty, and people are finding a way to move forward. And it's not enough to just survive. You have to have that beauty. And I feel that over and over again in the lushness with which you're writing. And there's a parable in the book that you tell multiple times throughout the book that I found really moving, which is a Buddhist parable of a man who's being chased by a tiger, and he ends up falling off of a cliff, grabbing onto a strawberry bush, which is inevitably going to come off of, it's like it's not strong enough to hold him for long. He won't be able to save himself. And there's the choice there to savor the strawberry, right? To savor the actual strawberry. And I was so moved by it because it was like, even if, I say this often, I'm like, even if we are going out with a bang, like even if we cannot turn it around and we can't get ourselves back in right relationship with the planet, we're still in the miraculous world. There's still beauty everywhere around us. And perhaps instead of by fighting, the work that we need to be doing is savoring and loving and noticing, reckoning, honoring. And I wonder for you, what do you see as some of your strawberries?
Oh God, playing with the kids in my family or any kid who comes along, at being outdoors, moving freely, dancing, conversations, cooking, flowers. I'm a lousy gardener, but a great lover of, like, I was in the Rose Garden in Golden Gate Park. I love that we have this public beauty for everyone. Yeah. So, but I also
someone else is actually taking care of. I'm like that too. My partner is the gardener, and I'm just like, oh, how lovely.
Yeah, but I also feel like something really interesting happened to me recently, which is I feel like, because I do a lot of climate work, as you have in many different ways. We spent a bunch of years trying to convince people that we're in deep trouble. It's really
Yes.
scary. Really bad shit could happen.
And
It's
leading
so
with the
nice about being on the
crisis.
radio and being able to use profanity, incidentally.
Isn't it
And
fucking great?
it is. It is. And but I feel like, so we kind of have built the case for enough people that we're facing some very dire things. And now I feel like part of the job is, people under 30 something have never lived in a below average temperature month in their lives.
Mhm.
It will be too easy to be, I think, as we move forward, just in the way that if you were born in Afghanistan in 2001, you've never known a time without war.
Right.
I think that one of our jobs now, and this is really the job for poets, for artists, for writers, is to talk about how beautiful the world is. And what we're doing as
Yes.
climate activists is protecting beauty. And it's not a trivial or optional beauty. It's that the very orderliness, the orchestration, the interconnection of the systems on which we depend is order and pattern and beauty. And I feel
That's
like
right.
we need to tell the stories about how beautiful it is, because that's what we're trying to protect. That's what we're trying to return to. And it
Yes.
would be easy for people, and this is not just about the young, because I know most old people have not enough memory. And I feel like as an
Yeah.
old person with historical memory, I'm always trying to say, like, do you realize there was no mass homelessness before Ronald Reagan? Do you realize the University of California system was tuition free into the 1960s? Do you realize?
Yes.
And so I think we need to remind people both that the orderliness we're protecting, the patterns, the interlocking relationships between plants and insects and other animals and seasons and weather and sometimes humans is beautiful. And that we also need to continue seeing beauty in the world. I think one of the
Yeah.
fears we're calling climate grief is the sense that we'll lose all that beauty. And one of the things I think about sometimes these days is non-biological beauty: the sun, the moon, the stars, the sky,
Mm.
the clouds, the ocean, just dewdrops on grass, rain.
Yes.
We had torrential rains yesterday after 200 something days of no rain.
I
And
heard. I was on a meeting with like everyone in the Bay yesterday, and it was
yeah,
like gorgeous hearing them and hearing the new they're like, I think my roof is leaking. I'm not even upset. It's just like it's raining. Yeah.
yeah. So that's something that's I forget where we even started with this question, but I want to put that out there as beauty being, I think, climate but also this is back to, is it possible for pleasure and justice to feel the same way? I think
Yeah.
that justice is beautiful, and it's beautiful with a moral beauty, which is one of the things I was trying to write about. A lot of what
Uh-huh.
beauty is for Orwell is clear language that tells the truth,
Yes.
is, honorable conduct, integrity, justice,
Right.
generosity. And so I feel like maybe there's a way to rethink a lot of what our goals are in the activist world as beautiful, not in some decorative way, because we
Yeah.
often see beauty as optional,
As
which is
something we
something that in
sprinkle on
most
afterwards,
to me.
Well,
Yeah.
I feel like I've been wrestling with this. Tony Cade Bombara said that, the work of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. And I feel like for the longest time, I didn't fully understand that. And I really, like many organizers, I was like, if it's just people need more data, they need more facts. Like if people understood the facts and the data, they would, of course, be like, well, we have to turn this around. And it's even as a storyteller, as someone who's like in my heart a fiction writer all the time and a poet trying to write nonfiction and say relevant things, I feel like that it was slow even for me to understand that there's a story that we need to tell, and it's a story of this beautiful world, and it's a story of what relationship with it could look like. And I think right now the challenge before us is, how do we tell a story that doesn't sound to people like a massive sacrifice? Because I think when we talk about being post-capitalist and moving into different ways of understanding our economy and our relationship to climate, people get stuck because it's like, oh yeah, I want the earth to continue, but I also really need to order from Amazon, and I really need to have everything right when I want it, and I can't,
Yeah.
people can't really imagine themselves before this. And I'm grateful that you said, yeah, but there was a before this. And it helps, I think for most of us, one of the things that can help remember is that there was something before all of this. There was something before the US experiment. There was something before this identity of Blackness. There's something before this identity of queerness. There was a before, there'll be an after. This is a temporary period, but how much impact will it have on the beauty that's left? How many species will we not be able to fall in love with and worship and adore? And I do think in some ways, the more I fall in love with the planet and the natural world, now like I have to be surrounded by plants. Like everything over here is plant life. My writing space is plant life. Everything has to be, I need to be in earth. I want to be covered around myself with it. And I think part of that is I'm in love with it, which I'm like, it's different to look at it, observe it. It's beautiful to fall in love, which I think is where justice also happens, right? There's something about justice that is rooted in deep compassion and deep love, right? To say like, oh, you made a mistake. We will hold you accountable. That can be, right? What would it look like if that was a loving act rather than a punitive act, rather than a disconnecting act? And I think the greatest solidarity that's available to us is actually available inside of all that beauty. I think you experience this too, and it shows through this is when we're traveling, if you're paying attention, all you see is these small moments of beauty and humanity and the ways that we're caring for each other. And it's almost like, how do we move these systems, these massive systems that move us away from that? How do we move those out of the way? Because we're already oriented towards loving each other. It's just we get distracted by all of this. And maybe as my last thing before we want to come to the audience. So I just want to tell you, audience, we're going to be turning to you soon. So if you have questions, please write them in the comments section so that we can make sure that we get them. But I want to read this to you. This is a paragraph from, it's right at the beginning of the book, page 14. You say, I had not thought hard enough about those roses I had first read about more than a third of a century before. They were roses, and they were saboteurs of my own long acceptance of a conventional version of Orwell and invitations to dig deeper. They were questions about who he was and who we were, and where pleasure and beauty and hours with no quantifiable practical result fit into the life of someone, perhaps anyone, who also cared about justice and truth and human rights and how to change the world. And as I was reading that, I was thinking about this past year of pandemic and quarantine and how even those of us, before the pandemic, I was home maybe 2 to 3 days a month. I was going and I felt very relevant in my going. And I was like, it's a carbon offset, whatever it is I'm doing and saying, it's all good. It balances out. It's worth it. And the pandemic slowed me down. And suddenly I was in one small room, or in my little apartment with my beloved. And I had to drop my attention down and local and close and find all these small beauties. And I think my question for you is, what do you see as the opportunity for the left, for movement, for those who are fighting for justice inside this period of pandemic and quarantine? Because I think a great change is available now if we see the opportunity of it.
That's been so interesting to me. I think on sort of the largest scale as we go into the Glasgow Climate Conference.
Yes.
The world's wealthy nations just offered to pledge $100 million for climate transition to poorer parts of the world. I'm getting the details a little fuzzy, but it's $100 million. And it's like, the U.S. alone just spent $3 trillion on pandemic relief. Like they need to put about 3 more zeros on that sum.
Yes.
Some of the obstacles we faced all through climate organizing has been the powerful saying, we can't make sudden, profound changes. And the pandemic steals away that excuse because we just did. We stopped almost all air travel. Everyone stayed home. We closed schools. We changed how we did everything. We invented a vaccine. And then the other thing is, we can't afford to do that. And of course, we can't afford not to do it. And destroying the planet would be, in any sense, very expensive. And we have the resources. We just have to reorganize the world. But what I also find fascinating, and it's hard to talk about because a lot of people died in the pandemic, and it was very unfair who died. We know
they're still dying. Yes.
Race and class and poverty. and the nature of people's work had everything, access to medical care, underlying health conditions, had everything to do with who lived and who died. But a huge number of us stayed home
Yeah.
and had a relatively easy time. And what I'm hoping, because I've heard so many stories about people who at some level deep in their lives, and I used to joke that I had life arrhythmia. I didn't travel as much as you, but I felt like every time I got into a good groove with sort of eating, sleeping, exercising, and
Yeah.
maybe even writing, it was time to get on another airplane again
Yes.
to go, and disrupt all of that. And so I kind of like got a rhythm, and, and I saw a lot of people deepen their relationship with place. Gyms closed, so people started walking a lot. Bicycle sales and garden seeds and plants sales went through the roof.
Yes.
And people really localized in ways that I think we've talked a lot in the environmental movement about wanting people to do. And
Yes.
I know, and if you're poor, that was really hard if you lived in a too small house without enough internet, et cetera. But a lot of people, it did model that all this rushing around for those of us who are more privileged was actually a misery. And that underscores a larger thing, which I think the climate movement hasn't played up enough, and I need to write about more. The climate movement, with all its Priuses and compact light bulbs, was constantly suggesting that some kind of mild bourgeois sacrifice was necessary, that this was all about giving things up. But what we actually need to give up is childhood asthma from air pollution, incredibly filthy industries that are destroying us politically as well as ecologically.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful passage by Cristina Figueres, the Costa Rican who negotiated the Paris Climate Treaty, about how clean cities will be if we go to this renewable world that we have to go to. There was a girl in the 2014 climate march in New York City, the one with 400,000 people on the road to the Paris Climate Treaty. She had this great sign that said, "What if it's all a hoax and we just make the world better for nothing?" Because what we're not really underscoring is that by decentralizing energy production, producing clean energy, stopping the extractivism that's so destructive, and that, as Hopkins points out, is always racist because it always comes at the expense of the indigenous people, whether they're in Africa or South America or New Mexico or Alberta. That actually we gain so much if we slow down the rush to produce, which is the rush to consume. Our lives get better in the way they did for those of us who just had more time, more depth, more connection during the pandemic. So I think in a way we kind of need to talk about what climate change, not what it demands of us, which we know, but what it's offering us, which is a chance to end the frenzy and the alienation and the literal and political poison and psychological poison in many ways.
I deeply agree with you.
With that, we should probably go to the audience, and I can't wait to find out what people are thinking.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you both so much for this amazing conversation. I could honestly listen to this for hours. This has been so amazing and inspiring. Thank you both. I want to start with a couple of comments. We do have a couple of questions, but give the audience a little bit more time to think about their questions as well. First, Sean says, agree with Adrienne. So much of the rhetoric around necessary change is somehow punitive and needs to be inspirational. Darlene says, a pleasure to listen to you talk to someone you admire. There's actually a question there. I'll get back to the question then. A comment from Chris, co-owner of the store, who was able to watch a little bit of.
You froze, Shane.
Shane froze a little bit.
Oh, it's kind of funny. He prepared us for if we failed, but he didn't prepare us if he failed. It's very amusing. Maybe I should ask you a question. And
I do want to say that shout out this one, Chris, who said just know this directions towards is all yes, question.
Am I back at all?
Yes.
Oh, hi, Shane.
Great. I have literally no idea what you said because it all sounded like a computer speaking. So
Yes. I shared what Chris said and you made it back.
Thank you. Okay,
It's
great.
all good.
Let's get to a question then. So let's
Okay.
get to Darlene's question. Do you consciously set out to bring ideas through vivid illustrations of activists? And do you find they have hope, pleasure, and justice in common?
Is that for both of us?
That is for whichever of you has a response.
I'm ardently committed to being what my friend Sam, who sent me after Orwell's Trees, calls the hope lady, with hope not at all as the optimism, which is the sense everything will be fine so we can kick back, which is just the flip side of pessimism, which is that everything's going to hell, so there's nothing we have to do. But just hope as a sense of possibility, the sense that the future is not yet written and we can participate in writing it sometimes in some ways if we stand up and do stuff. And so I am looking for things like that. Orwell is not where I thought I was going for hope, but the Roses kind of led me there with Orwell as an example and as a way to think about the possibilities and to get back to beauty and to just in a tricky kind of way see if I could write a book about anti-fascism that was also beautiful and pleasurable.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like you wrote a book that is in the same way as his life. It's like there was a lot that was hard about his life, and he could have easily turned inward or isolated or given up or become extremely bitter. And instead, there's so much beauty and passion, that he's writing from his passion, and then he's turning and cultivating beauty. And I would say I absolutely set out to bring in everything I write, and definitely as I move into the realm of fiction, I'm like, I want people to understand what a beautiful life it is to care, to not give up on caring, to not become cynical, to not think that there's nothing to be done, even if the thing that you can do is actually quite small. And when I first started out organizing, the stories I was interested in were those at the largest scale, and like, how do we change the largest scale things? And I think the thing that has been shifting has been, I'm really getting into the fractal of like, what are the many, 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 many small scale ways that a radical life can be a beautiful life. And I think when I look at that, I'm like, oh, it can happen in whatever work you are called to, whatever gifts you have. That can be a location of a radical, beautiful life. And, I see that you living that as a writer, it's like, it's not that you left the left, right? It's like you use all the gifts of channeling and research and writing and everything to help uplift the climate crisis and to help uplift justice and to help uplift the actions that we can actually take. And I know, like many people, it's like when it's election time, I'm just like, Rebecca, what do we need to focus on? Like, where do we need to turn? And it's not because you go door knocking, right? Like you use the gift you have
from time to time.
But that's not what impacts me, right? Like, like I'm on the other side of the country, but I'm still moved into the actions that are relevant for me, or I know what they are because of the way that you write them, right? And it's like, that's one way of doing it. And then there's a million other ways of doing it.
I guess another thing that comes to mind is if you tell people things are hopeless, you tell them they have no power.
Yes.
And the very function of being an organizer and activist and the assumption is that we have some power. And one of the things I found very moving is how people who've been enslaved, imprisoned, people in concentration camps,
yes.
Death camps, victims of domestic violence, etc., where they found moments of power, which are also often moments of beauty, and where is their agency and their creativity, and and I feel like the people who try and tell us, it's the kind of doomsayers. I kind of don't even know why people do that. That whole like it's too late to do anything, it never works kind of stuff. Like.
Yes.
Okay, we could get into a long conversation about why people do that, but like, don't. Please.
Well, no. I mean, it's also like, there's a big part of me that's been relaxing into, I'm like, those people are going to keep doing what they're doing, and the haters will keep hating, and the trolls will keep trolling. And all of it just means we have to be even more compelling with the beauty, and even more, that's part, to me, that's part of why this book feels important, because it's like, in the midst of this time of crisis, we could focus on so many things. And here's what we're going to focus on. And it's going to be good for your spirit. Like, I was like, I didn't know I needed this, like, again, this slowing down and diving in, and permission to meander and to wander and to feel. And I think that capitalism, the way that capitalism works is it makes everything work, everything labor, everything production, and everything misery at the end of the day. Like, even the wealthiest people can't stop working. They can't just relax into having enough. So I'm like, the opposite of that. The anti-capitalist thing is to make it all pleasure, right? To be like, actually, I don't care what you think the value of this flower is. It's beautiful to me. I put time and energy into it. I love it. It brings me joy. And I was listening to something Esther Perel was talking about, surviving the Holocaust, and how it was like, the thing that gets us through is the moments of beauty and the moments of imagination. They hook together, and that's what carries us forward. And I'm like, oh, that's what Orwell was doing. That's what you're doing. That's what I'm doing. Like, we're trying to figure out, like, how do we bring these things into a relationship with each other? There will not be a justice in a punitive, miserable, ugly, cold world. It won't happen, right? Justice actually, in some ways, is nourished by the places where we feel beauty and compassion, and we recognize it's okay. It can be okay. In the world where it can be okay and beautiful, I can find room for forgiveness, and I can listen to an apology, and I can offer accountability, right? It's connected.
I love the idea. I find a really interesting way to think about things sometimes is ask what is the opposite, and
Yes.
look at the problematic or incomplete ways gardens can be the opposite of war. But the idea of pleasure is the opposite of capitalism is so fantastic, because capitalism is always pretending, whether it's porn or beauty products, which, or whatever, vacations, pretending to offer us pleasure. But there's always that kind of franticness, and capitalism wants us to be alienated and miserable, because that's what makes you a good consumer. So pleasure is,
then we'll keep buying. Exactly. And it's the opposite. It's like, actually, you could be satisfied. You can be satisfied right now, right here, today, by the beauty of this sunset.
And pleasure is also, at some level, uncommodifiable, as a kind of things money can't buy.
Yes, the real thing is, and I think also freedom is like that, liberation is like that. It's like, there's no price for it. And it's collective, like, even if it's a non-human collective, I think of the relationship Orwell has with the roses is a relationship, it's a relationship with the natural world. And I find that, like, I have great friendships, great beloveds, and I have a really powerful relationship with my tortoise. My tortoise is teaching me a lot about how I need to be to move through the world right now, and to make it, and to handle the changes. I learn a lot, and there's a relationality that actually matters, that is available inside the pleasure. So.
Oh, I love that, lessons from the tortoise.
Oh my goodness. They're simple lessons, but it really is like, slow down. You have everything you need right now. If you need to tuck in, sleeping is fine. Sleeping is my turtle spends 20 hours a day sleeping, and they seem to be living quite meaningful life for themselves. I'm like, I'm doing fine.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Stephanie says, the wealthy with their immense access to pleasure have a dearth of the love that fuels justice. How do we get them to use their power to sustain us all instead of increasing their quarterly profits?
Can we just tax the hell out of them, a la Elizabeth Warren, who I was so excited about?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, there's a lot of misery that goes with wealth that should prove, I don't know, that wealth, like, obviously people need their basic needs met. This is not like, oh, it's fine to be impoverished. We're seeing the desperation of debt, lack of healthcare, lack of secure housing, educational debt, etc. But but there's a sweet spot, and that where people have enough. But what we don't have, I think about a lot in this society, is a security that means that you can feel like you have enough. I think that insecurity is inseparable from greed. If you can never be secure, you always need more. And I think in a kind of social democracy setting, it would be like, I will never be homeless. I will never be without health care. I can stop working, consuming, exploiting obsessively. And, we don't really have any model of enough in this culture. Or at least, we do in many places. We have it in indigenous places. We have it in alternative places. We have it, in the natural world, etc. But the loudest voice in the room is capitalism and the powerful, and they don't have enough because enough is not a concept for them.
Yeah, I think, this is one of the biggest pieces of pleasure activism, as I talk about the fact that excess is counter to pleasure. Like when you have too much, you lose your capacity to feel any of it. And I think that numbness comes into it. But I'll say, I think early on in my organizing life, I made a decision that my work was not going to be trying to convince the wealthy to give up their wealth or convince white people to give up their white privilege, but it was to make it more compelling to be otherwise. And so it's like, it's not more compelling to be poor, but I know what it's like now to have enough. And I know what it's like to have joy and pleasure. And I know that I don't need to be a billionaire or millionaire or any of those things to have that. And I feel, and I wake up each day and I'm like, oh, I know myself to be freer than those who have extreme wealth. And cultivating that in community with other people, where it's like, I have relationships that I never have to question if I matter. I don't have to question why people are in the relationship with me. There's nothing transactional happening. There's a lot that is mutual happening. I think the more we cultivate that space, the more that those who are not in it will seek it. Well, they're hungry for it already, the loneliness, the addiction, I'm like, I've spent enough time around the extremely wealthy to recognize that there's a dearth of joy in that space. And I think we all seek that joy, that safety, that dignity, that belonging. And so I think the work we have to do is to belong to each other and to belong to the earth. And I think everyone else will eventually find their way.
In other words, you want to redefine wealth as existing in connection and relationship, and confidence and well-being and pleasure, and not in,
not in a piece of paper with green ink on it that says it's about something that's gold somewhere. No. I'd rather have a collard green.
Well, I want to share Lee's fantastic words that kind of sum up how a lot of the comments and how I feel. Lee says, "Thank you both for bringing more pleasure and beauty into this world." And that is exactly how I feel as well.
Thank you so much for hosting this, Sean. We really appreciate it. And Rebecca, thank you for asking me to come and talk with you. This, I hope, is the first of many conversations. I am so just blown away by your brain and your life, and I'm grateful to be in this lifetime with you.
I am so grateful and inspired by you, and so excited we got to have this conversation, and only just a little frustrated because I feel like we have hours and hours of talking to do. So
I know.
if you're ever in San Francisco, let me make you dinner or show you the Rose Garden, and let's continue. And thank you, everyone else. And thank you, Sean. And thank you, independent bookstores.
Yes.
To owe my living, and so many people owe their imaginative lives. And
I just want to remind everyone that, yes, thank you, Rebecca, for holding up more. All of these fantastic books are available for sale. It is absolutely time to be thinking about what you would like to give people as gifts. Yes!
I love it.
Gifts, awesome. These would make fantastic gifts for your friends, for your family.
So you're doing great.
Thank you both so much. And to the audience watching, we hope to see you again really soon.
Yes.
Have a good night.
Thank you, everybody. To be continued.